welcome everyone in this very beautiful early morning on Saturday in Warsaw. We're very happy to have you all here, and we're very privileged to have Professor Elizabeth Dunn today with us from Indiana University Bloomington. She has just arrived in Poland, and it's the start of a Europe tour for her. So this is the first stop, and then she goes off Berlin, Oslo, different places, getting in. So today we will hear a talk which will speak of very urgent and very up-to-date issues, which is the migration and refugee policy of Trump in the US and what happens there. But before we start, I would like to introduce Elizabeth Dunn a bit to you. Of course, every one of you already knows her, especially that she has been translated into Polish, but let me introduce her shortly. So Elizabeth's work focuses nowadays and for the last 11 years mostly on forced migration and on IDPs. Her recent book, the last one published, which is available in our library upstairs, is The No Path Home, Humanitarian Camps and the Grief of Displacement, published with Cornell University Press. This is a book which she will talk about in the masterclass later for the PhD students, and this is a book focused on Georgia and on the IDPs who have been removed to camps in Georgia. And so this is based on a long-term 16-month fieldwork there in the refugee camps. Before, Elizabeth Dunn has been working on Poland and also on food. So these are the two areas. It is post-socialist studies. This is the anthropology of food and the transformation of Poland and labor. So probably most of you know the book Privatizing Poland because it has been translated also into Polish and is available, has been renewed with Critical Polityczna Press. So this is a very important study, and we all come back to it in our researches. So not to make things longer, I would like to invite the distinguished guest, Professor Elizabeth Dunn, to come here and deliver this urgent speech, which comes out of research, but also out of anger about what is happening today. And so I invite you, Elizabeth, the floor is yours, and then we'll have a time to discuss with you. Thank you.
So as I was reading this talk this morning, I realized that it sounds kind of crazy. And then I realized it's because my country has gone completely insane. So to the degree this sounds fabulous, in the sense of being a nightmare or being some kind of a fantasy, you'll have to decide how much of this is mine and how much of this is Trump's. On the 1st of May 2019, Donald Trump asked the US Congress to authorize $4.5 billion in spending to address what he called a humanitarian crisis on the US-Mexico border. There was indeed a crisis on the border. Thousands of people from Central America fleeing violence had come to the border to seek asylum in the United States. Men, women, even very young children were sleeping outdoors at ports of entry, most without food or money, and many in need of medical care. But the humanitarian aid that the Trump administration was requesting was not for the cots and pots and tents of traditional humanitarian aid. Rather, more than $1.1 billion of that aid was money that would permit Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, to arrest undocumented adult migrants and incarcerate them in overcrowded, cold, and dirty facilities run by the Department of Health and Human Services. Another significant proportion of the remaining $3.3 billion in aid would be spent to detain unaccompanied migrant children, many of whom were being kept in indoor pens or cages fenced with chain link fencing. Under the label of humanitarianism, then, the Trump administration was proposing an extraordinary level of violence. Indeed, Trump's new humanitarianism was taking place not only on the border, but far from it. In July, Trump announced that, and I quote, ICE will begin the process of removing millions of illegal aliens who have illicitly found their way into the United States. They will be removed as fast as they come in. Under the codename Operation Epic, ICE began raiding people's homes, banging on doors with flashlights, displaying guns, and threatening the inhabitants. In an internal memo about the raids, administrators wished ICE agents in the field happy hunting. Many undocumented people began leaving their homes as rarely as possible to avoid being tracked down in public space. But undocumented people kept on disappearing, taken away by ICE to federal detention facilities, that is prisons, where they might spend months before being deported to countries being plagued with poverty and violence. So what does the word humanitarian mean in the context of state-sponsored violence against migrants? It might be easy to see this just as a form of hypocrisy or deceit, an attempt to cover a politically unpalatable truth by naming it as its opposite. But in this lecture, I want to argue that in the peculiar logic of the Trump administration, hunting migrants was humanitarian action. By chasing migrants down, incarcerating them, deporting them, and hunting them again when they returned, the Trump administration has created what I call predatory humanitarianism, a form of humanitarianism based less on care for the population than on hunting down perceived threats to it. The intersection of humanitarianism and the manhunt, care and predation, indicates a much wider shift into another kind of power, synergetic power, or power built on the ability to hunt down threats from within. Synergetic power, I argue, fundamentally transforms the humanitarian enterprise. It changes not only the form of care being provided, but also the people who provide care, the people to whom care is provided, and the state itself. Although the case I'll use today is from the United States, predatory humanitarianism is not unique to the United States. It is gaining traction in other parts of the world, and it's changing the way we think about migrants, about care, and about fundamental relations of citizenship and shared humanity. I want to talk now about pastoral care and predation. So what does it mean to be a humanitarian? How do humanitarians choose the so-called beneficiaries of their help, and what kind of aid do they provide? How does humanitarianism, which begins as Foucauldian pastoral care, degenerate into predatory humanitarianism? The relationship between humanitarianism and pastoral care has been a hot topic in anthropology for over a decade. Didier Vassin has argued that humanitarian reason stems from the injection of moral sentiments into the practice of government, and it invokes a notion of shared species being and demands the provision of care. But humanitarianism is never a relationship among equals. It shifts the political conversation from a rights-based discourse to one based on the suffering of the precarious, and in doing so creates a profound disparity in power between the providers and the recipients of aid. The goal of humanitarian governance is not just to provide the proverbial bed for a night to a social and political equal then, but to create an entire constellation of services that will discipline the recipients of aid and transform them as acting subjects. This is, of course, what Foucault called pastoral power, or the state's care of a human population in the way that a shepherd cares for a flock. In Foucault's rendering, pastoral power is benevolent. The shepherd or the state makes the flock, or the population, healthy and productive. As Foucault writes, what can the end of government be? Certainly, not just to govern, but to improve the condition of the population, to increase its wealth, its longevity, and its health. It's no surprise then that migrants are primary targets of pastoral power. Zygmunt Bauman argues that the border politics of globalization throws up surplus human beings as waste, which then must be disposed of in garbage heaps, such as refugee camps, asylum systems, and urban ghettos. But this is a complete misreading of what these sites of humanitarian engagement actually do. Rather than functioning as trash dumps, humanitarians want camps to function as recycling centers, where damaged people can be disciplined and transformed through pastoral care. This is the logic of integration, to restore the lost sheep to the flock, as in the biblical parable of the sheep. Humanitarians often seek to remake migrants as newly useful workers and quasi-citizens, and to send them back into the polity. To do so, the humanitarians create built environments that encourage right behavior and ideology. They create rules for the conduct of everyday life and institutions that provide services ranging from job placement assistance to psychotherapy. But if pastoral care is used to make some migrants live, others are left to die. Over the last 4 years, images of danger and death have pervaded the debate over refugees and asylum seekers. The images of migrants crammed into boats on the Mediterranean Sea, of drowned children face down in the sand, and of people dying in the Sonoran Desert are so well known they have become iconic. This is more than just abandonment or exclusion from the polity, more than just a refusal on the part of wealthy countries to open up the doors. It signals that exposure to death, not just the governance of life, has become an integral part of the governance of migration. Asylum has argued that today, necropolitics has taken precedence over biopolitics, saying that sovereignty now rests on, quote, the generalized instrumentalization of human existence and the material destruction of human bodies and populations. For the most part, this destruction has been achieved not by outright killing, but by creating barriers that drive migrants out into the desert and onto the sea, hostile landscapes where the risk of death is acute. Although this is often a death sentence, the killing is not carried out by states or their armies. Instead, the killing is done by the earth itself, which has been weaponized to destroy migrants before they can enter. As the anthropologist Jason de Leon has written of the US-Mexico border, the terrible things that migrating people experience en route are neither random nor senseless, but rather part of a strategic federal plan that has rarely been publicly illuminated and exposed for what it is, a killing machine that simultaneously uses and hides behind the Sonoran Desert. Passive killing like this, using the desert or the sea, is a timid halfway step between pastoral care and synergetic power, the power of the hunt. It is something more than just allowing people to die, but something less than killing them directly. By forcing people into lethal environments, the state tests the social and political boundaries of acceptable action. Will there be public outrage if migrants are forced into the desert or the sea, thereby discouraging many others from even trying to migrate? Migration policy over the last 5 years has been a process of constantly testing what citizens will become numb to, expanding the boundaries of acceptable cruelty steadily outwards. The Italian government's arrests of Carola Rackete, a German ship captain who rescued migrants drowning in the Mediterranean Sea, or Scott Warren, an American geographer who was arrested by US Customs and Border Patrol for giving food and water to migrants in the desert, shows that humanitarianism has now been turned on its head. Now, helping the suffering is an assault on the polity, while allowing migrants to die is following the law. Anyone who interferes with the state's topography of death or who interrupts the work of the kill zones is a criminal because they are undermining the state's right to let people die, a right which is now the foundation of sovereignty. It's for this reason that the Italian Prime Minister, Matteo Salvini, called Raketa's rescue of migrants and her insistence on docking at Lampedusa an act of war. Scott Warren likewise was charged, actually he was recharged this morning with harboring migrants, which is a felony crime. Although both Raketa and Warren said they acted on principles of shared humanity, their humanitarian actions were, in fact, a crime of solidarity, an assault on the state's necropolitical power to expose people to the risk of death without killing them directly. So the turn from biopolitics and pastoral power to necropolitics would seem to be an end point, but there is still a further step. The state can move from simply forcing people into deadly environments and letting them die to actively hunting them as human prey. This is the turn to synergetic power, or the power of the hunt. I want to talk now a little bit about technologies of tracking. How does a state move from passive killing to active predation? In the United States, the turn was quite literal. In March of 2019, 2 months before the request for billions in humanitarian aid for the border, Donald Trump's richly populated imagination turned towards active killing with literal predators. According to the New York Times, Trump first began dreaming of a state-built landscape of lethal obstacles. He wanted to reinforce his border wall with, quote, a water-filled trench stocked with snakes or alligators that could hunt migrants as prey. And he demanded that his aides produce cost estimates, leaving aside the problem of creating a water-filled trench in the middle of the desert. The sort of unrealism of this is part of its impact, I think. In addition, Trump wanted the wall to be electrified with spikes on top that could pierce human flesh. When aides told Trump his draconian imaginings were cost prohibitive, he turned towards more conventional forms of violence and publicly suggested that border guards just shoot migrants who were attempting to cross. When he was told that killing migrants was illegal, he suggested that the border guards should merely shoot them in the legs. Like pastoral power, predatory humanitarianism separates the population into the citizens, that is the sedentary population, and the others, the mobile population. Unlike in pastoral power, though, the motive in predatory humanitarianism is not benevolent. The synergetic state conceives of migrants not as people to be cared for or to be abandoned, but as quarry to be hunted, not just because they are the other, but because they are marked as diseased lambs, ones that pose an active threat of infection to the rest of the flock. To preserve the health and welfare of the citizens, predatory humanitarians believe they must hunt down and remove the migrant. So synergetic power does in fact contain a kind of twisted humanitarianism, a twisted humanitarian reason and a drive to protect. In his claim that the situation on the US-Mexico border was a humanitarian crisis, Trump proffered the explanation that building a wall and preventing migrants from entering was in fact humanitarian towards them because it would prevent sex trafficking. But his lack of concern for actual victims of human trafficking, as seen in the sharp drop in visas given to victims of trafficking, made his claims to be providing humanitarian aid to those who crossed the border very hollow. As the head of a legal center providing pro bono representation to victims of trafficking said, quote, the administration appears to view trafficking as a convenient tool to justify its border policies, rather than as a human tragedy to be addressed. Likewise, Trump made a great display of what he called angel families, or families in which someone had supposedly been killed by an undocumented migrant. Although most of the deaths were in fact not murders, but accidents involving drunken drivers. And although the Trump administration only found 36 such families, even going as far back as 1990, he frequently used the angel families in speeches and rallies to portray migrants as a deadly threat. For example, in an Oval Office ceremony with the angel families, Trump said, "Your loss will not have been in vain. We will secure our borders, and we will make sure they're properly taken care of eventually. The word will get out. We've got to have a safe country. We're going to have a safe country." So Trump apparently appeared to actually see his request for predation as humanitarian action. He simply meant that the humanitarian gesture was aid for US citizens, for potential angel families, not for the migrants themselves. Hunting migrants is meant to protect citizens from biohazards, gangs, drug cartels, terrorists, and drunk drivers. It's also meant to ensure that they have privileged access that citizens have privileged access to the labor market. And it's meant to keep wages high by preventing low-wage labor from entering it. It is meant, most of all, to protect the white English-speaking population from the threat of cultural contamination and of societal and political change. In predatory humanitarianism, then, humanitarianism is no longer a blend of violence and care in the way that Didier Fassin or Miriam Tickton have proposed. Rather, it is violence as care, predation as salvation. In criminalizing mobility, the state seeks to provide security by the capture of one person in order to save another. As O'Neill and Dua write, synergetic power is, quote, a politics constituted by the tracking and capturing of humans and animals, but especially of humans as animals. This means that the synergetic state depends to a great extent on technologies of tracking. Like the pastoral state, the synergetic state is mobile and individualizing. That is, it uses technological means to discover information about individuals in order to improve the overall welfare of the flock. But here, technologies of tracking and instruments of knowledge production are used to track the prey, not to aid it. Sometimes they make the analogy between people and animals quite literal. For example, when Scott Warren, the American humanitarian, was tracked by Customs and Border Patrol, agents used the same tripod-mounted spotting scopes usually used to hunt deer to hunt and track and watch Warren giving clothes, water, and directions to men from Central America. Increasingly, however, the synergetic hunters are using even more sophisticated means of tracking migrants. As a recent New York Times article about ICE agents showed, the new digital tools have made it more and more possible for both ICE and Customs and Border Patrol to know where migrants live, who lives near them, where they work, who their family members are, and where they travel. By contracting with firms that compile data from driver's license bureaus, social media, and other sources, ICE learns where migrants shop, what cars they drive, and who they associated with. ICE even watches undocumented people's Facebook accounts, finds out where they sell handicrafts and used clothes, and uses this information to hunt and capture them. In fact, the story they told was about an undocumented Mexican woman who was making birthday piñatas for children. And when she went to sell one, to meet someone in a church parking lot to sell a piñata, it turned out that the people who said they wanted to buy it were ICE agents, and she was arrested in front of her own children, and they have not seen her again. Other technologies promise even more detailed and individualized means of tracking. On October 22nd, 2019, that is like last week, The Department of Justice proposed a new regulation that would let it collect DNA samples from all, quote, non-US persons who are detained under the authority of the United States. The proposed regulation claims that the DNA will be used to track down violent criminals, citing the case of the railway killer, an undocumented immigrant in Texas. But as immigration advocates point out, DNA information is the most intimate information you can take from someone. And it can be used to identify not only a migrant, but that person's relatives, to know their histories, and to provide information that can be used to track them inside the United States. The state is no longer only casting a wide net, the way it did 20 years ago when it conducted raids on large workplaces, hauling in all sorts of people and then letting some of them go. Instead, the hunters are taking deeply personal knowledge that under pastoral power might be used to discipline and care for them, and instead using it to precisely, almost surgically, target individuals. I'm going to talk now about the new subjects of predatory humanitarianism. Predatory humanitarianism is not just an ideology or a set of practices. It is a relational field, one in which new agentive capacities are generated not only for the state, but for other people who enter into the relationship between the state and its migrant prey, often unofficially and often literally through gaps in the border fence. Like traditional humanitarianism, which spawned all sorts of non-state roles and institutions, from international NGOs to medical missionaries to self-appointed humanitarian aid workers, predatory humanitarianism also opens up room for non-state organizations and non-state actors. Take, for example, the rise of non-state hunters. Along the US-Mexico border, Customs and Border Patrol and ICE are not the only predators. There are also vigilante groups engaging in a heavily armed game of cat and mouse with migrants. An article in Newsweek shows the Texas Border Volunteers, a non-state group that hunts migrants with dogs. In the Border Volunteers' own self-produced video, there are pictures of migrants on the ground with their hands over their heads, with an armed man in military fatigues looming over them. In another video, this one put out by Fox News, militia groups like Arizona Border Recon and the United Constitutional Patriots go out on patrol in the deserts of Arizona and New Mexico, searching the arroyos for footprints and setting up animal tracking cameras to catch migrants on the trail. They are dressed in military camouflage and carry semi-automatic weapons such as the AR-15 rifle, the gun most often used in mass shootings in the United States. Like Customs and Border Patrol, or ICE, the vigilantes claim to be there to provide humanitarian aid, both to migrants dying of thirst in the desert and to the American population, which they see themselves defending. And indeed, when they find migrants in the desert, they first offer them water and food, right before they force them down at gunpoint and call Customs and Border Patrol to come pick them up. It might be tempting to think of these militias as rednecks playing army in their spare time, and some of them are. They're retired plumbers and airline captains and engineers who come on their vacations to hunt migrants at the border. But many of the militia members actually have the training to go with their uniforms and weapons. They're discharged veterans who have fought in Iraq or Afghanistan, who bring military routines and tactics to the chase. The vigilante hunters see themselves as patriots acting in the name of the nation state, a welcome volunteer addition to Customs and Border Patrol, or ICE, who are stretched thin by the number of border crossers. The state, however, has a much more ambiguous relationship with the volunteer hunters. On the one hand, the Department of Homeland Security, which is the parent organization of both Customs and Border Patrol and ICE, issued an official statement saying that it, quote, does not endorse or support private groups or organizations taking border security matters into their own hands. On the other hand, though, CBP arrives when the hunters summon them to pick up the migrants they have captured. They do not ask the vigilantes to disperse, they do not seize their weapons, they do not arrest them, even though kidnapping and impersonating an officer are felony crimes. Instead, Border Patrol agents often speak collegially to the vigilantes and even thank them for their service. The tacit alliance between vigilantes and the state suggests that synergetic power is not merely the property of the state, as Grégoire Chamaillou suggests. Rather, synergetic power is increasingly distributed to a range of non-state actors who can be prompted by the state to act in its name without actually receiving direct orders. There has been much written about the dog whistles in Trump's speeches and tweets. Dog whistles because they're at a frequency that only dogs can hear, or these are coded words that only people on the right wing can understand. There's been much written about these dog whistles in Trump's speeches and tweets, moments when he makes oblique references to right-wing conspiracy theories or says things that for extremists imply an order to action, while at the same time preserving his own ability to deny having made such an order. This has been labeled stochastic terrorism, or the use of mass communications to incite random actors to carry out violent or terrorist acts that are statistically predictable but individually unpredictable. In the right-wing vigilante groups, there is something similar. They repeat words from Trump's speeches nearly verbatim, but without attribution. That is, they say them as their own words, suggesting that they have internalized the message and believe they are acting at Trump's behest, even though they have never had direct orders. So predatory humanitarianism carries with it not only the possibility of creating new classes of hunters, but also new classes of prey. As the logic of predation diffuses throughout society and people come to assume that somewhere someone is acting in ways that will damage the population, other potential groups of prey come into view. This free-floating anxiety begins to pervade political and social life, making members of the population uneasy and suspicious, and creating a drive to hunt that becomes, as Catherine Verdery has written, a constant state of mind and aspect of emergent subjectivities. The domain of possible prey is becoming boundless. Not just the migrant, but the Jew, the homosexual, the intellectual, the liberal. And indeed, a couple of days ago, a congressman was heard saying, Democrats are not our opponents, they are our enemies. The target of the hunt can shift with the political winds, allowing predators to shift who is prey almost at will, summoning stochastic hunters to pursue both real people and imaginary figures. Although this looks like madness, and when you hear some of these conspiracy theories, in fact, they seem absolutely unhinged. You can't believe that anyone would believe these things. But what makes them compelling is not their factuality, but the fact that parts of the narrative are internally consistent. And it's internally consistent because of the logic of predatory humanitarianism. The idea that there is a hidden enemy inside, one that must be tracked, hunted, and captured in order to save the weakest among us, is a persuasive frame, one that can knit together seemingly unrelated, disordered, or chaotic bits of information into a story that makes sense even as the target changes and the narrative about the kind of danger they pose takes on elements of fantasy. I want to end now by talking about creeping predation. It would be a vast overstatement to say that predatory humanitarianism is replacing pastoral humanitarianism. After all, the logic of care continues to operate, not only in the private and NGO sectors, but also in the work of state agencies. But it is fair to say that predatory humanitarianism is diffusing. Its agents, its targets, and its methods are proliferating, entering into more countries, more state agencies, more social groups, as it becomes normalized, once again, as a mode of governance. We see it infiltrating new spaces and new terrains, such as the Bulgarian-Serbian border, where a civilian named Dinko Valev chases Syrian asylum seekers on horseback or on a four-wheeler, with state-owned military vehicles close behind him to arrest any migrants he captures. He describes what he does not as immigration enforcement, but as sport. In Hungary, the mayor of Asylum, a village of 5,000 people on the Serbo-Hungarian border, has organized local villagers into a civilian militia that hunts migrants in vehicles, on motorcycles, and on horseback. The militia forces captured migrants to pose on their knees with their hands behind their heads, and then takes pictures to be posted as trophies on Facebook. The logic of predatory humanitarianism is also entering other domains of social life. In Kevin O'Neill's brilliant new book, Hunted, which I recommend that everyone read, it's an absolutely breathtaking book. In Kevin O'Neill's book, Hunted, Pentecostal pastors in Guatemala City hunt down and capture drug addicts in order to imprison them in makeshift rehabilitation facilities at their families' behest. That is, the families are paying these pastors to hunt them down in the night and to incarcerate them. This extrajudicial imprisonment is effectively sanctioned by the weakened Guatemalan state, which itself cannot provide any drug rehabilitation. At the moment, the goal of predatory humanitarianism is capture. The state and its stochastic agents merely capture prey in order to isolate it and eject it from the general population. But there is always the potential, once synergetic power becomes a norm of governance, that the goal of the hunt will no longer be capture, but extermination. Even now, extermination is done remotely by deporting people back into life-threatening conditions and allowing other states or non-state actors to do the killing for the hunters. Like the manufacture of washing machines or the growing of grapes, the dirty work has been outsourced. But that does not always have to be the case. The move from passive to active killing is very easily made. The goal of synergetic power in the end is not actually about protecting the flock from migrants or from anything else. Instead, it's really about building and consolidating right-wing movements. As Jason Dunn, an official in the Trump administration's Department of Justice, and my brother, told me, I interviewed my own brother for this project. He told me Trump knows that old people hate immigration. They won't say it out loud because they know younger people don't want to hear it. But old people stand with Trump against immigration and they want him to end it. And he needs old people to win this election. This echoes Shamayu's analysis of the goals of synergetic power. He argues, extreme right-wing movements recognize in the hunting pack a social force capable of providing them with a base for their political hegemony. Having come to power, they institute a state racism in which racist hunting becomes the heart of a program whose murderous goals can then be pursued with the means of state power. The point of the hunt is not to provide humanitarian aid or to reduce the number of undocumented migrants, no matter what justifications are offered. Migrants are, in the end, completely beside the point. The point is to hunt and capture a different prey, the state itself. By whipping up fears of invasion, by stoking resentments against ethnic and religious others, by mobilizing citizens as hunting packs, Right-wing movements and their wealthy backers seek to hijack government for their own benefit, to hunt and capture the state itself. Regulatory capture is one goal. The right wing uses its capture of the administrative state to change regulations in ways that benefit corrupt businesses. Along with this comes rent capture, a system that enables the capture of wealth through the exercise of violence and occasionally lethal power, as Jason Kahns has written. In this sense, predatory humanitarianism is not just aimed at expelling migrants or protecting the population, but at pickpocketing the general citizenry. Predatory humanitarianism is thus bound up in a much wider and more complex political and economic system, one in which the fundamental questions of politics are about who has the right to prey on whom and to what ends. The Trump administration has announced that its right to predation is absolute, announcing yesterday that even if the president himself committed murder, he would be immune from prosecution. The question now is what means are available to block this predation and to end the cycle of capture, release, and recapture. Thank you.